All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming. I have a great group here in the building, and looks like we have a number of people online. Ben, do you want to kick things off? Or?
Yeah, sure. All right. Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining, especially this year in person, and then everyone who's here online as well. As you all know, we had a pretty eventful few weeks since our last meeting. And so we have a pretty stacked agenda today. So I'd really like to get some of the business items out of the way before we move into it. But with that, I guess maybe we can do a round of introductions and then dive into it. So I'm Ben Stireman. I'm the Sovereign Lands Administrator, co-chair of the Salinity Committee.
Marissa Weinberg, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, and serving as the interim Great Salt Lake Coordinator.
I'm Bonnie Baxter. I'm Director of Great Salt Lake Institute at Westminster College.
Thomas Wolsteels with Berm Cooperative.
Tim Hawks, Berm Cooperative. Joe Addison, Compass Minerals. Kyle Stone, Division of Wildlife.
Christine Rumsey, U.S. Geological Survey.
Andrew Rupke, Utah Geological Survey.
Tom Tripp, U.S. MAG. Greg Miller, Division of Water Resources.
Ryan Rowland, USGS Utah Water Science Center.
Jeff and Blaker. You can go in the back of the room here.
Mark Reynolds, U.S. MAG.
Laura Vernon, Water Resources.
Jamie Barnes, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Linda Freitas, Friends of Great Salt Lake.
Phil Brown, Berm Cooperative.
Great. And then online, could you please show the listing? So yeah, I see Ben Holcomb with DWQ, Elliot Jagniecki with UGS, Jim Harris, DWQ, Jennifer Biggs here from Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, Jody Gardberg, DWQ, John Luft, Wildlife Resources, John Mackey, Division of Water Quality, Krishna Khatri, Water Resources, and Layla Mahdi, Water Resources. Did I get everybody there? So that's everybody on the list. I don't know if anybody's lurking in the background there. So, well, great. As Ben said, we do have a packed agenda here, and one revision that I was just thinking we would make to the agenda is to take care of some of our business items first before we get into the salinity and talking about the berm. But looking at the agenda here, I guess two business items. One is I wanted to hit on the meeting summaries I sent out for our 2 meetings in January. Number 2 is our discussion about the charter, so we facilitate, make sure we're doing things well going into the future. Number 3 is the SOP that we have for density measurements. Want to touch on that, and then get back into our agenda here with the update on lake conditions, update on the berm modifications, and scroll down here, and then talking about the protocol for the berm modifications. And so there's a lot to cover there, and somewhere I know lunches are supposed to be delivered here before noon, so at one point we'll break and grab the box lunches. Hopefully we can keep talking, keep working through the lunch hour. And I guess I want to say, in terms of the protocol, we want to definitely continue the discussion that we've been having about that, and keep pushing that forward. That's the goal. I don't, it'd be great to have something today, but I think the expectation is that hopefully here in the next month or 2, we can come up with something that we can work with, and then keep working on that to keep improving upon that. So, anything else I missed?
No, I think we can, when we get into the updates for the berm and the protocol, we can get into that.
All right. Computer keeps turning.
You want me to kind of start talking about the charter here?
Yep.
Okay. So one of the things that became apparent in the last several meetings when we've it's come down to having some emergency meetings and trying to get some consensus in a short amount of time is that our charter doesn't support that. We also had some issues with online participation. So we made some modifications to the charter that you all should have received along with the meeting invite. Very simplistic, but the goal was to allow for us to be able to call meetings quicker, so we don't have to wait those 20 business days. And then we would also have a slight modification to the way that our committee is made up. USGS doesn't vote on issues, so we thought it was important to have an odd number of voting members. So the way that we had decided the way that we thought this would make sense was to have non-voting members and voting members. So with that, we would need to add a voting member to the committee. And then I think the committee could also designate non-voting members if we find some value in the future to having voices that can contribute, but wouldn't be in the final vote. So that would be allowed in this. We did review the Utah Open and Public Meeting Act statute and decided that we're probably not required to adhere to Utah Open and Public Meeting Act, but for the sake of being transparent and forthcoming with all the issues that we're working on, we would like to just continue to operate as if we are down to those rules. So that was the main guts of everything. So I don't know, we could go through these one by one if everybody felt the need to do that, or if folks have had a chance to review it, we could talk about any modifications or adopt the new agenda if people are comfortable with doing that. Does anybody have a preference or any questions about the modifications to the charter?
And Jeff, one question, maybe a suggestion. Looking at the makeup of the committee, it's well represented here, makes up that list. But there's one missing very important entity, and that's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm not sure. I mean, they hold a lot of the answers to the questions that are generated. And I know James, is knowledgeable on the state side, state 401 side. But it's with our past meetings, recent meetings, it seems like there would have been good opportunity to have the Corps represented, maybe be able to answer questions or provide some feedback.
I think the Corps would also make up a non-voting member. I agree with that. If I could suggest another voting member, I don't think we're represented by the environmental community though.
But this was supposed to be a technical group to technically advise the Salt Lake Advisory Council, which does include representatives from NGOs and others. So this was supposed to be the technical arm to give technical advice. So I don't know if we want to have non-technical people.
Before we dive into who is going to be the voting member, I don't think that's something that we have to do today in the modification of the charter, because what that says is that we will have 9 voting members, and it doesn't describe exactly who they are. So we know who the 8 voting members are now. And I think what Jeff had indicated was that you all can make proposals to folks that you thought would make good voting members. And we already have identified the areas of expertise in which we would want committee members. And so if you all have the ability to pick your brains and send recommendations to Jeff, we can see if there's any duplicity in the nominations, and then decide next time how we would bring that forth. But for now, we can simply just operate with 8 voting members and have USGS as a non-voting member. Thomas?
I mean, just to be on record, based on the comment that Tom made, the charter does say reflecting the range of scientific and technical disciplines and interests required to achieve the proposed objectives.
Okay, I would agree with that. I think so. For today, if you haven't had a chance to read the charter, I would suggest we just go through these changes one by one to make sure everybody's aware of what we're suggesting. I don't want any surprises.
In the future, to give us a red line version.
There's a compared version and a new version.
Is there?
Yep.
I read the charter. I would motion to adopt it.
Agreed.
Perfect. That's a second to the motion. Anybody have any conversation to the motion? So we can just go ahead and take a vote on that. So all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And any abstaining?
I'm going to abstain, just based on that opinion.
Okay, perfect. So we will, it looks like the motion to adopt the charter as it was written passes. So we'll go ahead and have that serve as our new charter. So with that said, let's plan on picking our brains and filling out who we might want to fill that last voting seat on the committee. So if you have any ideas for that, please forward them along to Jeff, and we will bring those next time and perhaps have a vote if we can get some good recommendations there.
And I think to Tom's point, I think he is right. We do have a statement in here that committee members should be actively conducting or coordinating scientific or some technical work. We did want to span the spectrum of interest, but we also wanted this committee to be focused on the science and be able to provide those technical recommendations up to the divisions and to the advisory council. But here in the charter, we talk about who the members are. And so if you can take a look at that and I guess an action item for you all, specifically for the members, you can send me your nominations for who you think that should be. So I think we want to make sure that the committee does represent, the interests that we have across the different entities who are doing science and making decisions. But we also want to make sure we've got an odd number of voting members. We can have a majority or we can go forward. So
I did just have one other comment real quick on the makeup of the committee. We do have several commercial interests on the committee, and the purpose there is to have the South Arm industry, the North Arm industry, and then also aquaculture represented. But it's very specific in the charter that we're taking those commercial interests in consideration for the interest of that sector of the lake or that sector, and not the specific interests of the businesses that you represent. And that goes for everybody on the committee. We want to make sure that we're very conscious of that.
But again, if you look at Boss Steele's Havasu and Trip, these are people who have technical background.
Exactly, and I don't disagree they should be there. I just think when it comes down to the specific interest of the companies that are represented, there's a fine line there to make sure that we're representing the
Perhaps expand it to some of those other groups that have been mentioned based on their technical.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes, we're here to talk about salinity and the different interests in the lake, but nobody walking away benefiting for one specific thing in general. So I think we're in good shape on the charter, and then we can go ahead and move forward with the other items of business.
super. The next item I just wanted to touch on was with regard to the standard operating procedures that we developed a year ago or more for how we measure density in the lake 2 years ago. I think that was a great step forward. Phil Brown pointed out to me that when he plugged the equation that we typed up into that document that the results were not correct, and there was a typo in that equation. So that raised the question of, and that's the equation of state that's in the SOP. So what we want to do is we want to correct that mistake, make sure we've got the correct equation in there, so that others who aren't familiar with what's going on in the lake are using the correct equation. But what we want to do, I guess the question then became, I was talking to Andrew about how do we best do that? Is that via an errata sheet that we attach to the document? That's one method. Another way would be to update the SRP that's available online. And that, I guess, raised another question, which was just, are there any other updates that we would want to make to the SOP in terms of how we're measuring or where we're measuring the density? And I think, and Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, but the SOP talks about how to measure the density and how to report it, and then how to calculate a salinity from the density, obviously with the correct equation. But there's a couple things that we thought that might be worth mentioning. The SOP previously referred to that it wouldn't be accurate for using it in the North Arm at higher salinities or lower salinities than what the equation was originally developed for. And I don't know results of the USGS work has been published yet, but that would be something I think would be useful or valuable to state in the SOP that we're no longer bounded by one range of salinity, but that the equation of state is now valid for a wider range. So that would be one key component that would be good to update the SOP with. And then the other was just, I think, came out of listening to the discussions last month, where we have, it's great. We have numerous people making density salinity measurements on the lake, and I think when we're discussing what our observations are, I think it's important that we recognize how they're being made and where they're being made, because we can end up with a range of values, which it might be accurate, but I think we want to make sure that we're using similar, or at least acknowledging the methodology that was used to measure that and to report that value. And I think further as we start to talk about protocol, for use in making management decisions, I think it's important that we recognize where we're, have a standard protocols to where we're going to measure that density and salinity, the physical location, but also the depth in the water column that we do that, just so that we have a consistent method there. And so one possibility is that, as we think about, and this isn't an item for action today, it's more of a request for the members here to think about how to best do this, is that perhaps we can add to the SOP just to say, for management decisions, we want to be using one site, or we're going to take the average of these 3 or 12 sites, and we're going to do it at a consistent depth, just so that if I'm just trying to think ahead, that we have a Great Salt Lake is obviously in the media worldwide now, which is great. I think it's getting a lot of interest, a lot of researchers who are, very interested in the challenges that we have here at the lake. And I think we want to make sure that as new people are coming in, or even amongst ourselves who are working on the lake day in and day out, is that we recognize that try to use similar or the same protocol. And so I think when we report a salinity, we want to make sure we know where that's being measured. And I think here, I know in January we were, I know my question was, has anybody made any measurements? And I think we had a variety of measurements that were being made. And I know, thinking back on it, I know we have people, you were all making different measurements, or making your own measurements for your own purposes, not necessarily for a regulatory action. So I think it's still useful information, but I think we also, it's important that we, when we're talking about those, that we recognize that different conditions. So
So just a little bit of an update. Brian and I had a conversation Friday afternoon. And stop me if I'm misrepresenting you, Ron, but it sounds like the equation of state is not premature to try to apply that to the North Arm. So, at this point, it seems like maybe the quickest thing to do is just make the correction. You looked at the equation. I think the quickest thing would probably be just to update the equation and put a note at the beginning of the report noting that that it has been updated, so that when people get a hold of that, they know they have the most recent version. It's reasonable.
okay.
And building on that, it is true that the most recent work we've done on the equation of state, which we presented, I think, to most people, we have extended the density range that the equation is valid for, and it goes up right. I think the highest density in that most recent work is 1.20. I could be off a digit. That's a big deal though, because we're talking about where we have mineral precipitation and where we don't potentially. So I think we could update the standard protocol in the future and just talk about that we're now comfortable using the equation up to this density value. It's not, it doesn't get us to the full range of densities we see in the North Arm, and we're hesitant to go there with the equation state right now. That would require additional study.
Would it be appropriate to update it so it's up to 1.2?
We want to publish that first, and Christine that's getting incorporated in the Salinity paper that she and Scott and others, she's cooperating with others here. And so we want to get that published and out, and then we could update the procedures in the SOP document.
All right. So, but it's not, I think you want to make sure that the equation is correct. That's out there. So perhaps we should just update that SOP and update it again later on.
And we looked at it, looks like it's a simple typo. Yeah, in the SOP right now.
Does anybody, any concerns with just updating the SOP with the equation? And then we can revise again later if that's appropriate. Okay.
Cool. Take care of that.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. All right, let's coming back to, I think, any other business items? Those are the things. Thank you. It's great work to talk through those. So I guess the next thing is just the update on lake conditions. And ask Ryan and Christine if they can give us an update here.
Okay, we'll just jump right into it. So we'll give our usual update on elevations, discharge / velocity monitoring that we're doing at the new breach. And then Christine will take over and give an update on Salinity. Next slide. First, let's start off with great news, and this is great news. So the snowpack is of February 10th. This is the snow water equivalent for the state from our friends at NRCS. And you can see everything's in the blue. Those values are all 150 to 196% of normal throughout the state. It is unfortunate that the Bear River Basin values are a little lower. They're at 138% of normal in terms of snow water equivalent, but we'll take what we can get. So this is great news. We're holding on to the snowpack. Next slide. Here's the update on lake elevations at our Saltair gauge. The Saltair gauge is back online now. The water levels have come up enough to bring water into the marina where the gauge is, so we're happy about that. So the daily value yesterday was 4190.1. That's up about 1.6 feet from the low out at the site, or well, on the south arm. That's great news, right? All of last year for the spring runoff period, the same period, we only came up about a foot. Plus or minus a tenth. So this is great news for the south arm. I'm showing data going out to 2019 on this plot, and looking at the most recent data. Just look at the slope of the line at the rate of increase this year. That's a steeper slope than we've seen historically, but we all have to keep in mind now we're making modifications to the berm. That's playing into it, and that's going to really play into it going forward as we'll see. But that's the current status for the south arm. Next slide. So here's data for our gauge on the north arm at the old Saline boat harbor. So on the y-axis, it's lake elevation in relative to the 1929 datum, which is the datum we report to out at Great Salt Lake. We're looking at the same period of data back out to 2019 to current period. So yesterday, the daily value was 4189.2. That's up about 0.7 feet from the low in November. So the north arm is not coming up as fast as the south arm. And we can all imagine that might have something to do with what's going on at the berm. A little bit of a lag going on. But this isn't a big surprise, even if the berm weren't modified. Most of that fresh water is coming into the south arm and pushing it up quicker than water can move to the north. So there's the status of the north arm for you. Next slide. Just a quick look at the major surface water inflows. These are cumulative stream flow plots. This first plot is for the Bear River near Corinne. We're showing a water year on the x-axis, and we have cumulative stream flow on the y-axis in millions of acre feet. The bold black line is the current water year. Orange line is the minimum, the lowest ever measured. Blue is the highest ever measured. And then the shaded area is the 25th to 75th percentiles range. So we're currently, for the Bear River Corinne, hugging that lowest ever measured cumulative flow for this time of year. So hopefully with our spring runoff, we'll see improvement there. Next slide. This is Farmington Bay outflow at the Causeway Bridge. The bold black line is data for this year. Same exact type of plot. Really good news here at Farmington Bay. Our bold black line is just above the 75th percentile. This site's been doing really well in terms of water getting into the lake. So we're already up over 100,000 acre feet at this site, which is great news. So let's hope we keep it going. Next. Here's the Weber River near Plain City. So exact same type of plot. Bold black line is below the 25th percentile. We hope to see big improvement there with the spring runoff. Next slide. And here's the Goggin Drain near Magna, Utah. The bold black line is firmly within that green shaded range, almost at the 75th percentile. And again, we look for a good result here as we get into the runoff period. But that's the current status for these gauges on the major surface water inflows. Next slide. Okay, as you all know, we're measuring discharges at the new breach. I just keep updating this plot. We have data going all the way back to 2016 when the new breach was opened up. So we have discharge in cubic feet per second on the left y-axis, and then we have elevation difference between the north and the south arm on the right y-axis. So the gray shade, the gray line is the elevation difference. Blue circles are south to north discharge, and red is north to south discharge. And we're just going to zoom in on the next slide to the most recent data. So here I'm showing data from November 2021 out to the most recent data that we have out at the site. A couple things to note are the vertical line, dash line, which is when the berm was originally raised in July of 2022. When the berm was raised then, we saw both directions for discharge, the blue and the red circles, they dropped to lower values, and we had many zero discharge values for north to south, the red circles. But looking at the most recent data, you see the gray line, which is the elevation difference between the south and the north. We see a tremendous increase in the elevation of the south half of the lake relative to the north half. Now we're almost a foot higher on the south arm relative to the north arm. And the discharge values, the blue circles, for south to north flow jumped considerably to 800, over 800 CFS, which is this guy measured in late January. And then the most recent measurement for early February was 650 CFS, something like that, with zero discharge associated with associated with north to south flows in late January. And the February value has not been entered yet, but I think it's very, very close to zero. So the south arm is high. Flows were for running south to north increased concurrently with that increase in the south arm elevation. Next slide. Okay, this is data from our uplooker velocity meter just on the north side of the bridge at the new breach. I have velocity on the y-axis. Negative values are north to south, positive values are south to north. The zero line is what you really kind of want to pay attention to. I should have put a bold line in there so y'all could see it. At the lines in the time series plot are velocities measured at different depths at this location. And I have January 2023 out to the most recent data this month. And beginning after a big negative velocity, meaning all north to south event in early January, the velocities were basically all above zero, all indicating movement of water from south to north. Moving into late January 2023, you see some negative velocities. Those are associated most certainly with wind events. But the most recent data out where you see February and beyond, you'll note that all the velocities drop off, and now they're all noisy around the zero velocity mark. And it's my guess that that's when you guys finished raising the berm, was last week, basically. Yep. So when the berm was raised, there was an immediate response from our sensors in terms of measuring the velocity vectors in the water column, and now these velocities are all just around 0. So looks like we're doing what was intended by raising the berm, which is kind of shutting off flows at the breach. Next slide. Now Christine will give you an update on salinity.
Okay.
Putting her on the spot.
All right, so this is the plot we're all used to seeing. This goes back to 2010. And since we talked about methods today, I'll just reiterate the U.S. Geological Survey measures density from Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program water samples, and we convert the densities to salinity using the equation of state, which is reported in grams per liter. So that's on the y-axis. On the x-axis is time. You can see we kind of hit our high last fall, and we're continuing to drop down. If we could just go, actually, and the most recent values are 165 at 3510. That's our site in Gilbert Bay, and then 170 grams per liter in Carrington Bay at our site 2565. And those compare well with recent measurements by UGS at Black Rock, which was 167 grams per liter, and also a measurement we took on the 2nd, 167 grams per liter at the new breach for the south to north flow. And I'll just say these most recent densities were collected last Tuesday, so pretty recent. And then Jeff, if we go to the next slide, there's kind of a more zoomed in picture of this. So this is from October of 2021 to the present, but just so we can take a closer look at how these salinities are fluctuating. So as of last November, again, we're looking at those two sites, 2565 and 3510. We had salinities as high as 185 and 186 grams per liter at the end of November. January, they went down to 174, 163, and then in February, they've gone down a bit more to 165, 170. So we're continuing to see those come down, and we do see differences between the kind of the two bays. And the changes for each of them, so in Gilbert Bay, we've gone down by about 20 grams per liter, and at 2565 in Carrington Bay, we've gone down by 16 grams per liter since that high in November.
Christine, what depth are these samples from?
Yeah, sorry, these samples are all shallow. The changes are from the shallow salinities. Yeah, sorry.
Like 0.5 meters below surface.
Correct, 0.5 meters below the surface. And good point, Ryan. So we do show deep samples collected. They're shown in the circles for both of these sites. We haven't seen the deep brine layer at 3510 in a while, over a year. And then we did see the DBL disappear in Carrington Bay last fall. And we do see some stratification between the deep samples, which are collected a half meter above bottom, and the shallow samples, but that's likely due to just that kind of freshening fresh water coming in with all the flows we've been getting. So if we go to the next slide, you can kind of, I tried to map this out a little bit so we can see kind of the variability through time. Sorry, these plots are a little blurry, but basically I'm showing shallow salinity from last October, November, January, and then our most recent samples in February. And the colors are salinity ranging from about 125 to 190 grams per liter. So we tend to see kind of similar measurements for across our 4-site network in October and in November. And then we start to see more freshening at our sites closer to the freshwater inflows, particularly at 267, which captures the Bear River inflows, kind of where that's coming in. And then same thing we observed in February. So just so you can get a sense, there is variability in these measurements during certain seasons of the year, particularly when we get freshwater inflows coming in. So I just wanted to point that out. And with that, I think we are all done, unless there's any questions.
Do you have projections on spring inflow? Like if we stopped getting snow now and this snowpack that's so beautiful that we have, like how much of that would make it to the lake after filling aquifers? Do we have any?
We do not have any forecasts.
Maybe Craig does. I don't know.
The UCRB, upper Colorado, anyhow,
Yeah,
they have some estimates, and I can find those and forward them to you, but As an amendment to Bonnie's question, do we know what the reservoir storage is going to be? When the Speaker of the House had his symposium in October, pointing out that that was the #2 loss of water in the Great Salt Lake was evaporation from reservoirs. Are the reservoirs still quite low? Or are they catching up right in a hurry right now? So,
Actually, I've looked into this to update our leadership, and NRCS, USDA actually has soil moisture 2 inches and 20 inches. The 2-inch level is 200%. Yeah, and the 20-inch level is about 100%. So good rest. That seems like it should be, lend itself to efficient runoff. On the teacup diagrams, I'm not sure who has that. But Causey and Pine View are filling up nicely, and the southern reservoirs seem to be doing okay. I guess from Weaver Basin meetings that I attend sometimes, my understanding is they fill to somewhere in the 60%, just to leave some headspace for spring rains. So in general, there's a bunch of reservoirs there, but I would say that they're probably high 40s, low 50%. Fill right now, so it seems like there's going to be some interception of that, but fingers crossed it's above average.
So then we could start with a salinity in the south arm that's closer to 15%, say 150 grams per liter.
Yeah, I think Bonnie, based on kind of the trajectory we're seeing now, and we do expect more water, it seems, yes, we would get kind of below our high range at the very least.
But that's kind of where we started last year. I think we got down.
Yes,
Isn't it?
like
Yeah, that's
158.
kind of where we started, and then yeah. So hold back on the optimism.
Well, it's going to react differently because of the
Your point, Jeff, about how we measure salinity, I think what USGS is showing here is really relevant. That spatial variability that we see at times of year.
Yeah. Yep. I'm going to consider.
Thank you, Christina. That's really helpful.
Yes. Yeah.
I just want to clarify on your fourth plot there why you're missing the fourth data point.
Yes, I was.
That site was completely socked in with ice, so we could not access
Okay.
that. That was
On freshwater then.
so. Yeah, I mean that
Cool.
went out to. It's not going to be a whole lot to a lot of people, but AC3, your guys' site, that's how far west the ice was. I mean, it was.
So that's
between
coming in
half
from
and
Berry.
3/4 of the way across.
Arlington.
Newport Bay. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
solid enough that the boat struggled to break through the ice.
Wow. Wow.
So,
That's always less sailing on that north tip of Antelope. Yeah.
So I'm looking at the Colorado River Basin Forecast Center, and everything's at least normal. And so far, they haven't forecast any flooding, so we still got a couple of months.
Okay, but no dancing yet,
No, well, yeah,
unless it's rain dancing.
it doesn't look like the forecasts are not crazy, but they at least look like they're going to be normal or better.
I have a quick question about the South Causeway monitoring station. It sounded like it was down because of ice. Is that one back up and running? Do you prefer
that's
that we
back
only
online.
use the salt air gauge, or which?
I think you should
What's the
use the
preference?
salt air gauge whenever now that's back online. That's the site that we've been talking about for breaking records. It has a record going back to 1847. Yeah, the salt air gauge is the one you should be referring to. But we do have a gauge, as you all know, just south on the south side of the causeway near the breach. And so there was a period there between September and through early January. I can't remember the exact dates where that was the only gauge we had on the south arm because we didn't have enough water in the Great Salt Lake Marina. So that's changed. Now we've got water in the marina. Ice actually knocked out that second gauge near the breach, but it's back online now.
Great. One last question, sorry. In terms of these samples, you're collecting a water sample for them to do density measurements, correct? And is that monthly?
Yes.
Monthly? Right. Thanks. Right. Thank you. Any last questions on that before we shift? All right. Ben, could you give us an update on the berm?
Sure thing.
So I sent out an email last week to the committee to give some updates because a lot of things happened since the last time we met. But as many of you know, the governor issued an executive order instructing the division to raise the berm. And that was on February 3rd. And so by Tuesday on the 7th, we were able to work with the railroad to get them out there and start filling the berm. And shortly, I think they actually had the first, pretty much the berm was constructed by Wednesday. And then they're protecting it with a larger riprap. So this week they were finished by end of business on Thursday. And they decided they would let things settle over the weekend and go back to make sure that everything was still in good shape and finalize, all of the ingredients and bring everything back. So right now the berm is in. There might be a few little minor tweaks just to make sure the grade is there and everything's protected, as well as cleaning up some of the rock getting down to the actual berm. But it should be doing its job. It was set to an elevation of 4192. And so we're expecting that we'll see it holding back some water for the next couple of months. And let's keep it short and sweet unless anybody has any questions. Tom?
Have you made any estimates on transmissibility of this berm? Let's look at the size of that rock.
Yeah.
It's a lot coarser than the normal French grain is that's designed to let water through. So if we get a little more head on that, what do you expect the flow through will be?
So I don't know that they've done any specific levels of transmissibility, but we do know it's fairly permeable. And we've observed that while at the berm. And I think that what it boils down to is the entire causeway is permeable, as you and I have discussed before. This is probably a little bit more permeable than, even the causeway. But what it's doing is it's, restricting as you can see from Ryan's update.
It obviously helps, but it's like
Exactly.
we get 2 feet ahead against it or 3 feet ahead against it.
Sure. No, it could move some.
You may need to make it wider to increase the resistance.
It is wider. So as the construction, to keep the grade of a 3-to-1 slope, I believe that it ended up extending the footprint of that about 12 feet.
Okay.
So it is wider. And when they were out there, they were using, they had a wide range of rock. I think the smallest rock was 3-inch. That was filled in all the way up to 18-inch, and then it was protected with the very large rock that's along the entire causeway. And so you're right. We considered if we should line it with something, plastic or something like that, but that makes it a lot harder to go up and down. And the benefits of that were it didn't seem that it was there to do that. I think that from the modeling that I've seen from Craig and Layla's shop, we're very likely to be topping the berm this year anyhow. And so this is just slowing that and giving it a pinch point. I think that we're gonna see that we'll probably top it and send quite a bit of water still to the north arm. And this will just simply flow it and keep water flowing back from the north into the south. Bill?
Yeah, I just want to point out that this emphasizes, I think, a need to be exploring the use of concrete blocks to create these impediments so that you can stack them or you could actually have spaces between the bottom blocks if you wanted to allow flow from the north to south for some reason, for example. It just gives you the flexibility to either completely block flow or selectively allow flow at one level or another. And there are groups that are working on concrete derived from these saline waters. And it turns out you have a much stronger concrete when you develop it from saltwater mixtures. So I do think that's worth putting on the list of tasks. It's not really a research topic so much as a task, but I just want to mention that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bill. We've discussed that quite a bit. I think right now, as I think everybody on the committee knows, we're kind of in a react situation where we need to get this in, immediately, and especially with the governor's order. And our recommendation was to get this done as soon as possible and capture this year's runoff. But there is an overarching need to come up with a better solution. I think we could continue to move rock, and it's a really inexpensive way to do it, but it's probably not as effective as we would like it to be. So I've been working with water resources engineers to talk about, what other solutions might exist. And I think that this, we need to be, of course, conscious about the price, because some of those could get really expensive. But there are some improvements, and I think that'll be something that we explore over the course of the next year. So this year, you know, we're stuck with this this geoprism model of a berm, but next year I hope that we have something more like a Corolla or something a little more reliable. So we'll get there.
Looking for a Mercedes, Ryan.
Yeah, maybe the state will dole out the cash for Mercedes. We'll see.
Ryan saying Ryan. Fuck you, Ben.
But Bill does make a good point that it could allow, if you design it right, to open up, you know, the bottom of the, you know, whatever.
We might be in a
breach would be
situation where we need to
where
bring
you
that
want it.
regard.
Yeah.
Yeah, the preliminary discussions we've had have been super simple, like pilings with oak planks that you could do the same thing, and they seem to work in the WMAs, and it seems like it works on some of the extractive industry ponds, but it would be the same idea. We'd love to get to a point where we're able to send someone out there with a small piece of equipment and not have to mobilize like a large piece of equipment and do this. And honestly, if we could do it, you know, to the point where we can manage this, even to the point where we're modifying it, you know, once a month or once a week if we needed to, that would be ideal. So that's where we'd like to be, but we have a ways to go to get there.
Legos, Ben.
Yeah,
Legos.
I like it. We'll get Lego.
And 12-year-olds.
Legos and 12-year-olds come on board.
But I know underflow and overflow diversions that's commonly done. So where you investigate that water going over or under. So that, I think the technology's there. The key is what can survive in this environment, because those usually involve metal gates. And so and then the hydraulics, which the modeling that we've been investing in can help with that component. So great. Any other questions on the berm? All right. Well, good. I was just looking at the agenda and realized forgot to talk about the meeting summaries, and wanted to just revisit that, and then I think we can break for grab lunch out here, and we can jump into the next discussion point. Any comments on the meeting summaries I sent out for January 9th and or 19th? And if not, would entertain a motion to approve those.
So moved.
Both of them?
Sure. Yes.
All right. A second?
Second.
Any discussion?
Sorry to be the big discussion again.
That's
If
why I
we,
asked.
you know, if we're not a public meeting, then we can do whatever we want. If we are a public meeting, drop preliminary summaries within 3 days of the meeting. So I would suggest we make that ruling one way or the other. I think I don't have any great position one or the other. That is the rule. So if we're not, then we can just do it like we do.
That's a good suggestion. I think we should just operate as a public body and do that. So in the future, we'll.
Preliminary.
Yeah, we'll
But
do that.
does it have to be written, or does the
Has to be posted. Has to be posted on.
So if it's a link to the YouTube stream, is that it?
YouTube streams are, you know, there's strange rules in the state.
You can find
The
out.
written copy is
See,
the
they're
official.
not updated?
No,
That's shocking.
I'm saying the approved minutes are the official record.
Right.
You can say something completely different on your video or audio, but the approved minutes are what you're legally bound by.
I think we can just agree that we'll abide by the Open Public Meetings Act. And we'll find out exactly what that means with the minutes and incorporate that in our newer practice. Yeah, thanks, Tom.
I think right now we're wanting to approve so that we have those official meeting minutes for January 9th and 19th. So we have a motion and a second. All those in favor of approving those summaries, indicate with aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstained? Abstentions? All right. We'll approve those. Thank you. So looks like Marissa's putting the boxes out. Thank you. Want to take a let's take a few minutes and grab lunches, lunchbox. There's a water, there's an assortment there. And we can get back to it here and by noon, say 10 minutes. All right, well, let's get started again. Got about an hour left, and I think there's plenty to discuss here. So I want to see how far we can get in our conversation. So on the agenda here is a few key questions that I included on the agenda. What and when are key decision points? And I guess we're specifically talking about the Berm management. And I guess I should have prefaced that for that. So what we want to talk about, we talked about in January, and then now also with the executive order that our governor issued, is that we want to develop a management criteria, management plan for how do we intend to use this Berm going into the future. And, you know, when do we make changes? How do we make changes? Where do we make changes, et cetera? And I think this is something, you know, it's very consistent with what this committee's been talking about over the last several years when we talk about the research plan. I think the goal has always been to try to work toward developing a salinity management, long-term salinity management plan for the lake. And I think the condition that we've had here in the last few years with the record low elevations certainly has created an urgency that, you know, what can we do now? But also keeping in mind that we want to think about what do we need to do in the long term too. Hopefully the lake doesn't stay at its low. Hopefully it comes back up. So we need to be anticipating how the lake might change and how our management actions might affect that. So what we want to start to talk about today is really how do we develop that Berm management plan? Because that's really the issue in front of us right now. And some of the questions that I included here on the agenda were intended just to kind of get your creative juices flowing. What and when are our key decision points? What are the appropriate values? How do we know if we have a problem? How do we know when we succeeded? And you know, I think the discussion that we've had, especially over the last 6 months, has been when we look at the salinity matrix, we see that we've been above that threshold or that range of values that we felt was most protective of 120 to 160. And so as we saw, you know, a year ago, we saw that we were above 160. We took action last summer to raise the berm to reduce the import of salt into the South Arm. That was successful, and now this last fall, we saw the salinity going even higher, and we started to see impacts to the ecosystem. And so that precipitated the need in the discussion about, well, what else can we do? And so now we're here where we've raised the berm to 4192 with the idea that we would be able to capture spring inflows in the South Arm, dilute the salt mass, and hopefully keep the salt or the salinity from going as high as it did last year, trying to keep that as low as we can. So the need really is to, how do we know, I think some of these questions, how do we know that raising the berm like we just did was successful? What do we do if it is successful? How do we know if we still have a problem and what do we do there? And so there's a number of different ways to look at this, and this is, I think, what I hope as a committee we can start to think about and talk about. I think Ben and I talked a little bit about, well, what is a management plan? A management plan can be very detailed. It could take us years to do all the research, really have a plan that really thinks through all the nuances, where we do the research that we need to, the modeling that we need to do, get everything in the plan. But a plan can also be something that provides us with guidance here even now. And I think that's been our intent here as a committee, has been as we're observing changes in the lake, that we're making recommendations that we add, or hopefully trying to anticipate from the changes that we're seeing, so we can protect the uses of the lake. And so I think management plan, or as I sent out just the straw man out, I think on Friday, just call it, maybe even calling it protocol, something that can help guide our discussion, our work here, even in the next month or two or so. And with the intent that we continue to work toward improving upon that. So I don't want us to get locked in thinking that we have to have it all, 100% right, on our first try, because I think that could take us too long to get there. But we want to try to get something in place where our agencies, the public can see that what we're trying to do here and managing the Berm. Any questions on that, I guess, with the intent of what we're trying to do?
Jeff, I'd like to just add, from the governor's executive order requires us to come up with that protocol for managing the berm and when we will, reduce the height of the berm or how we'll manage that into the future. And it's expected from the governor that we'll have this done as quick as possible. And so we don't want to delay this, for several months. So if we can come up with something that's simple and satisfies the needs now, that, like as you said, that we can modify and get into the weeds a little bit more in the future. That's what Jeff's straw man does, and I think if we can stick to something simple in nature, it'll be better in the long run for all of us, and then we can hone in. And I think this summer too, we're working through some agreements with Ryan's shop to, really dial in on some of the monitoring, and we hope to find out what other gaps there are in monitoring so we can fill those gaps and better understand, what this manipulating the berm does and how we can better manage it into the future. So I think this will be a living protocol, something that as the Salinity Committee learns new information, we can make new recommendations to forestry and then also to water quality.
Mm-hmm. So it is a challenge. We've got the trees that are right in front of us that we need to recognize and we need to address. We want to keep in mind the forest. We want to make sure we're going in the right direction, but even perhaps thinking about beyond the forest, what direction do we really want to be going? So it makes it complex, but because we need to be thinking about this from all these different angles. But I think what we can do is we can take steps and we can move in that direction by trying to keep those different perspectives in mind. And so I guess I just wanted to just touch on some of the documents that I sent out last week to the Salinity committee members. One was a spreadsheet. I guess this was just my attempt last month in our meetings. We were talking about averages. Well, what is the average increase of salinity, or what's the average decrease in salinity each year? How about water levels? And which got me thinking, and so I just went to the data that I had on hand, which is the data from Saltaire and then the salinity data during 510. And those, I think that's something that as a committee we need to think about. Christine just showed salinity measurements at 4 different sites. Taking an average of 4 sites, are we just using one site? Those kinds of things. But what I try to do here is just try to understand, hopefully it's helpful for you just to understand the trends, in terms of what kinds of salinity reductions do we see or increases do we see each year. And I think, if we just look at, and this was for the period of 2010 through 2022, what we saw is, water levels on average increased 2.5 feet each year. Then they dropped, they went up 2.1, but they dropped 2.5. And what happens when that, we start to get the lake just keeps dropping. In terms of salinity, we see that in the spring, you get about 7 grams per liter decrease per foot of increase. Just trying to come up with some rules of thumb. So if we see the lake come up, we would see the salinity drop about 14 grams per liter. And similarly on the back side in the fall, as the lake is dropping, our salinity is increasing, and we're seeing that the salinity is increasing about 7.5 grams per liter per foot. And so if we're dropping, say 3 feet, we're losing, 24 grams per liter, or we're increasing 24 grams per fall. So those are, every year is different, and certainly now with the berm in place, these dynamics are different, but they start to give us some indication. And I did include in here some scenarios of what ifs, and what ifs can be helpful, but they can also be dangerous if we just take them as the gospel truth. And so I'm not going to pop those up on the screen here. You can look at the file and see, but they're just kind of my attempt to try to kind of game this and see, well, what could happen. So another document that I sent out to you all was, let's see, this was something that Christine presented or sent me, and it was just another way of looking at what could happen, with different salinity, and of course these are all based on just preliminary numbers, calculations, rough calculations that we're making based on the data that we have available. And Christine, is there anything you put you on the spot? But
I do it all the time. Good.
This is just a back of the envelope calculation using what we know about how concentrations change with increases in water volume, just a simple mass balance. So to predict, to estimate what the concentrations would be in the fall, given the two scenarios, because at that point we were kind of considering 4190.5 versus 4192. So just considering the amount of water that would be added in each of the scenarios, I calculated what the salinity would be, how much dilution you might expect in the South Farm, both for spring of 2023 and then the fall. Yeah, I just wanted to share that both with Jeff and Ben as just a way to use USGS and GSLEP data, in case that was helpful in your decision making. And I'm happy to go through that if it's necessary, but that was just.
Does anybody have any questions on those two on the spreadsheet, but then also with the slides that were sent out? I mean, what it showed, and Bonnie, I think you brought it up is just a little bit ago, is that, we can drop our salinity in the spring, but we have to remember that there's a rebound in the fall. And the question is, well, how much is it going to rebound? And if we, how low do we need the salinity to be in the spring for it to be okay in the fall? And then again, how high, if it's certain salinity in the fall, how low can we get it in the spring?
We're losing about 2.5 feet of water throughout the summer, right?
That's what the average has been.
In the olden days, it was 19 inches up and 19 inches down, when it was about 4,200. It seems we're a little more extreme now than it used to be.
Yeah, and climate change is setting our temperatures higher, so evaporation is higher. So,
Yeah, it's hard to say where.
well, we are experiencing a warming trend in the summers, right? I mean, there are warmer summers now on record than have been.
You seem to have had that spring.
Yeah.
So,
But I'm saying there's so many models on that, you can't say, look at this model, it's going to do this. There's 50 models on.
I think we can use the models to project that it's likely to be warmer and evaporation rates are likely to be higher.
How much? That's the problem. I agree. But I think we don't have it.
Yeah, anyway, so 2.5 feet down is probably what we should anticipate. Right? Or is having more water in the system going to make that evaporation less? Right. Curious question.
Yeah, I don't know how things are going to play out this year. I do think it would be useful to just dial in on the numbers that we have. Can you guys?
Those are good numbers.
Yeah. So Christine, you probably will need to rescue me. I'm gonna probably slaughter this. She ran two scenarios based on how high the berm was actually finished off at. So it actually was finished off at 4192, correct? Okay. So based on her mass balance calculations and at this berm height, she predicts that we'll have a salinity level of 144 grams per liter in the south arm at the tail end of spring runoff. And based on assumptions on evaporation.
So it says right there, I assume the lake fell 2.8 feet, and that's based on what we saw in 2021 and 2022.
Okay.
Just as a
Okay. I didn't see that 2.8.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, and so with a drop of 2.8 feet, this is just, we're talking the south arm.
Right.
We're looking at 177 grams per liter in the south arm
So
around
we-
October, November.
So the berm really could drop it from 198 to 177.
I think that's assuming that the water level, that the inflows fill it to 4192.
Exactly. There's a number of assumptions in here that are imperfect, but it assumes that the water level will go exactly to 4192. There was no overtopping. So I know that's not going to be exact, but that's for the purposes of the calculation and the comparison. Good numbers. To work with.
Just want to clarify that the volume 3 that you're using in this calculation, it really in the past has reflected both evaporation and flow out to the north arm. Whereas in the future, with the berm closed, it'll be different, correct?
Yes.
Okay, that's all I wanted to clarify, because I agree with Christine. These are good, useful calculations, but what this means is that the 177 is probably a high value. It's a high projected value for the fall. We don't know what's going to happen, but it is quite possible the lake will drop less and V3 will be larger than what you know of historically.
Yes, and another thing, Bill, that I ignored here was inflows. I assume that they're basically negligible from the spring until the fall, which is also probably not correct, but for simplicity of the calculation. So yeah, I think you're right that 177 may be high. Yeah,
What was your inflow assumption?
that it was negligible from the spring to the
No,
fall.
for the runoff.
That it would just go exactly up to the berm height of 4192 or 49.5.
Equal volume associated with that.
I think Jeff would be toggled back. Maybe a couple more, because I think it was for the spring scenario. Yeah, right here. So that would be the volume. Let's see, the change in volume from November 30th. Yeah.
That's the volume.
You can.
You're assuming 600,000 ballpark acre feet.
1.2 million acre feet to get to 4192, of which we're already at 90.1, so we're halfway.
In order to bring the lake level up 1.5 feet, this is about 1.6 feet, 1.5 feet from where the lake level was in the south arm, that was about 537,000 acre feet. Looking at what already flowed into the north arm, that's 318,000 acre feet. We already have a benefit, 850,000 acre feet into the system. As far as I can look at some data that Craig and Layla sent to me, the average is like 1.72 million acre feet of inflow.
Like that.
Yeah, sounds about right.
This is a long time.
We're just from 2010.
Yeah. But last year we only had 800,000 total.
I know, we're sitting on 850. That's already happened. I mean, you tell me, I don't think we've really begun to run off in earnest yet. Correct. Understanding there's going to be some, interception of flow going into the reservoirs. The reservoirs aren't in bad shape. So 1.75 million acre feet, I think will certainly overtop going into 4192. bringing 140,000 acre feet, and that's assuming the 800 that's already happened, 850 that's already happened is part of that average. And I would argue that that's what's coming is probably incremental runoff. And
Yeah,
that 850 was a bit of a bonus.
Yeah.
For a better term.
totally.
I just want to clarify one more assumption. It seems like these berm heights were established by.
Yeah, they assumed that it was established.
So everything's going to be shifted because now it's been completed in February. So
Yeah, this was, yeah.
I think there's a lot of hypotheticals that are built into this, and that's what makes the modeling so difficult. Is that it's been a moving target for when we get this finished, and what 4192 would have done. And honestly, had we been able to get it at 4192 2 months ago, it would have been more effective. The modeling that Layla just recently done, or had finished, indicates that we'll probably, with a 2.5 million acre feet, if that was, similar snowpack year as to this year. And again, a lot of hypotheticals. We don't know what reservoirs are going to do, but if that happened, we're going to go well over 4192 on the south arm, and we'll be spilling in. So I think we'll be exporting salt, and water to the north arm, and probably coming out through the west culvert. But I think what is important to focus in on is that, in general, with all the hypotheticals and everything accounted for or not accounted for, there's still a benefit of 4192. And I think what we can tell with this is that, in the management plan or our protocol, that this is a good target because we know what it does, impounding that water, and that it does have an effect on salinity. And so I don't know that, we could probably talk about this all day and all the unaccounted for hypotheticals. And I think it'd be advantageous to move into the straw man discussion and start talking about, what this protocol looks like in the future.
I would maybe suggest, Jeff, because I think if you summarize it, what Christine did is say that there's a relationship between salinity and elevation. If there's a certain salt mass, and I think we can use that relationship to help with the management. And you might actually simplify. We did something. It's a variant of what Christine had done, and it's with a salt mass balance that's a little over a year ago. So it may not be entirely relevant today, but the principle is relevant. We've seen a couple of things. We've seen that over the years, when we change the culverts and when we put in the breach, we've seen that relationship between the salinity and the elevation change over time. We've seen that regression change. And I think what we could do is we could say, look, there is a salinity elevation correlation that we can look at given a certain salt mass balance. And if we remeasure that salt mass balance based on how much, because we know we might export salt to the north, we could also in the future import salt back from the north like we have done. And so then we can say, okay, with a certain salt mass balance, this is the relationship. Based on that relationship, this could be the target for the breach height or breach elevation. And I think what Christine has done is sort of pointed to that principle.
Yeah, I think to Ben's point, there's a lot of variables here, and a lot of them that we don't know. And I think one thing that I'd like to do out of today is not necessarily have a protocol that would say, yeah, this is great. I'd like to identify some action items that where hopefully we can all. One I wrote down here was just can we rerun the mass balance as knowing where we are today with the berm where it is today, and are there other action items that we can take in terms of even the salinity numbers that we use, which sites should we use, and which at what depth, and what is the data set that we want to use that would reflect the last 10 years that we can use for evaluating this. Bill?
I just want to underline what Thomas just said, because this committee hasn't revisited the fact that the lake level salinity relationships go through these different regimes. We had some good discussions about this earlier, but we haven't really followed up. And I think what Thomas is pushing towards, and I totally agree with it, is that the simple mass balance that Christina is presenting is great for going from fall to subsequent spring, assuming no inflows or no salt inflows as well. Those different regimes we've seen in the past, those different relationships between salinity and lake level have resulted from the back and forth between the north and south arms. And they need to kind of explicitly be in this analysis and in future analyses, I think is what Thomas is saying. And I think another way of saying it is, I doubt we're going to get there through the hydrodynamic modeling. I think the empirical data relating salinity to lake level and ultimately volumes is going to be a very, very important player in this decision making, and we need to not lose sight of that. And I'd like to see some follow-up on those curves, because we had some nice analyses, but it kind of ended, and we should round those back up.
I don't know if you have a.
Yeah, because you get Phil.
Well, we've got a couple slides that, you know, Phil can explain that show that principle. And yes, we would have to reevaluate the salt mass today, but then we could easily, you know, readjust that relationship between elevation and salinity for the salt mass balance today, and use that as a model for, you know, the next year, and then readjust that on a yearly basis, like Bill suggests. Yeah, Ronnie.
I just wanted to mention also this empirical analysis, I agree, is terribly important, but we pointed to a lack of understanding about the groundwater contribution to the salt balance. And I think that's why these measurements and staying on top of it is also really important if we don't know where all of the salt is coming from. And I think that's part of what Bill's getting at.
Joe? All right, good. Okay. Good. Well, why don't we take 5 minutes? I don't know if did you want to, I can talk to your slides.
So I'm going to put Phil in the spot next.
I'd like to have you show those, and then I'd like to, because then I think that these slides are something I probably need to send to everybody, because these are the kinds of things you need to stare at for a while and to try to understand and grasp what's really happening. I do want to make sure we can look at the straw man I provided, and we get some initial feedback on that. But I think what that helped highlight for me is, well, what information do we need to get pulled together so that we can start to identify some of these things. Oh, Philip, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, I'll be fairly brief on this. This is the type of salinity elevation regime change that Bill was alluding to. This is data that we presented essentially in the fall of 2021. It was the observations that essentially kicked off the brine shrimp cooperative's concern about the salinity trend that was occurring in the lake at the time. And so we look back at our own data, and since we agreed to talk about the where and how salinity is collected, these data points are the average of 1 meter salinity at 2 sites in the lake, and the deepest points in the Northwest Basin and the South Basin, and collected over time from our routine sampling program. And this data we've traditionally collected using a YSI salinity meter. We've discovered over the years that it deviates from refractometer values, and so we have a regression equation that converts it. And so this is data from prior to 2022, where we started taking both that kind of data and Anton Par densiometer data that we're trying to convert to salinity using the equation of state. So just to get that out in the open. And so what we noticed was this black relationship here is the relationship between salinity and the surface elevation of Gilbert Bay between 2011 and the end of 2016, right before the breach was opened, and a fairly strong linear relationship suggesting a fairly static salt load that is diluted and concentrated based on runoff and evaporation. When the breach was opened, we noticed that year after, salinity is remarkably low for the elevation. And so we tracked it over time. And so this gray relationship is between mid-2017 and May of 2020, and a very similar slope to the relationship, but set down about 20-25 grams per liter, suggesting to us that a lot of salt had been exported out of the south arm into the north arm when that breach was opened, and there's that massive one-way rush of water flow that's been documented so well by USGS. As we looked at salinities after May of 2020, we noticed that they seemed to be rising faster than the lake was falling. And so we plotted that again. And so between the middle of 2020 and the end of 2021, that's this red relationship where the relationship between salinity and elevation began increasing back towards where it was prior to the breach opening. And that suggested to us that there might be return flow of salt from the north arm, and that salinity in the south arm over this time period is not being driven only by the elevation of the lake, but by changing salt load potentially. This was our first indicator that something like that might have been occurring. Okay. Next slide. And this is a relationship we developed a while ago between, we estimated the salt mass in the lake, and we'll go into a ton of detail about that, try to keep it brief, but essentially what we found from estimating the salt mass using bathymetry and salinity at multiple elevations in the water column, including the deep brine layer, was that the salt load was lowest in 2017, and it did indeed go up in 2021. That's this line. This is the 2017 salt load. And that we saw that there could be some management application to this if you were trying to target the salinity range that we're looking at in the Salinity Advisory Committee, which is 120 to 160, then if you have multiple different salt loads, and you can predict at what lake elevations would you achieve those salinities given that calculated salt load. And essentially what we found is that the two different salt loads between the low of 2017 and the high point in 2021 makes a substantial difference in the elevations at which you achieve that salinity range that you're trying to target. And so, for instance, for the low salt load in 2017, you could stay within the 120 to 160 range at an elevation between 4190 and 4194. At the elevated salt load of 2021, that elevation range goes up to 4191.5 to 4196. And so that's essentially the relationship we drew there, and we thought that sort of thing could have some management implications in the future if you're trying to keep the south arm within a certain salt salinity range. Then that's the kind of relationship you want to look at. So, and I know that USGS has come to a similar conclusion with their data as well. So anyway, that's background.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what you can do there is you can say, look, if you want, if you accept the variations of on average 17 to 20 ppt per year, then you can say we don't want to go over 16, but we can stay at or above 14. Then that would give you an idea of lake variations that would happen within that year. And at the salt mass balance of 2021, you would be between 4191.5 and I think it's 4194, 4193. No, not at 12, at 14. So what is it at 4194?
3.5.
Oh yeah, 4193.5.
Oh.
So that would tell you that you would want the berm height today at 4193.5. Fill it up with fresh water. You'd get your 14% after evaporation of 2 feet or 2.5 feet. 14 to 20 ppt, you'd be at 160. Again, for the salt mass balance that we measured at that time, that salt mass balance may have varied already because we've exported some salt. When we changed the berm height, we stopped the import of salt, but we continue to export salt. So, but I don't think it would be that difficult to get an estimate of the salt load at different, on a yearly basis, for example, redraw that curve and say, based on the salt load today, we shifted this way or this way. And it could be a relatively simple tool to manage berm height.
I think the other thing we need to think about is how to get the north arm to do its job. The reason the salinity is low enough in the south arm is because the north arm's been socking away salt for decades. And so I think part of what we need to think about is how do we manage the berm in such a way the north arm is optimizing how much salt it's precipitating. And I think we can do that at some level with thinking about, when to raise and lower the berm. But what I think we want to try to keep the north arm density as high as we can during the summer, so that's precipitating the maximum amount of halite, at least while we're in these low elevation stages. Because once the breach was opened, it was from a qualitative perspective, it was just not precipitating salt like it had been in years before. But that's, just something to keep in mind.
I concur with what Andrew said here, but I think we're looking at too short of a time frame here, maybe as well, because we'll have other problems. In fact, we've seen the brine shrimp with too low. I'm looking here at a USGS report from 1987 that said in the previous historic low, it was like 1.27 salt in the south arm. So
I totally agree, Tom. This is
so we've got to have some idea that when the lake comes up to near historic highs, how are we going to move salt back, right?
Thomas?
Well, I think what that shows, we did that exactly when we opened up the breach. We moved salt back. I mean, that's the way to do it, I think.
Yeah.
That's pretty quickly.
But north arm is going to decrease evaporation rate, high concentration. So
I don't know, but history shows that it happens pretty quickly. If you look at those regressions between salinity and elevation.
Thomas, question.
We moved a third of our salt to the north arm in the last 50 years. 60 years maybe.
Thank you. Question for you. You mentioned based on this, 4193.3 would be the ideal to get it to 14. On that curve.
At that time, it could have changed by now.
But the question I have is, so that incremental 1.3 feet of water gain, it still has a residence time in the south arm. So it's because we've shown the inefficiency of water transfer between, we're approaching a foot in terms of that delta, and that's so it's not like it's lost. You still have a temporal benefit of having that additional water.
Good. Well, let's with the time we have here, let me
Bill has a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bill.
Thanks, Mike. Just want to raise the point that the term salt load is typically used as a rate. And so I think, Phil, you were referring to salt mass, right? The overall salt mass in the system as opposed to.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay. I just want to point that out because that could cause some future confusion. I'm happy with whichever term we use, but we just need to agree on it.
Great point. So I guess just to follow up on that, salt mass would be the static mass of salt in the water column. Salt load would be the flux of salt, the change in movement of salt.
So it's a movement, it's a rate of movement.
Yep. All right. So this last thing, I guess I want to make sure kind of talk through here. Because again, I want to identify some action items that we can take, working on this in the next month. It's just thinking, I guess, an initial thought exercise I just went through to how might this work. And I think, that in terms of a goal, I think it's important, and Tom, to your point, is that, we've seen salt move back and forth. We've seen a lot of salt move to the north. I think, I remember 3 or 4 years ago, especially, you were concerned that we're exporting too much salt to the north. And so, now we've got too much salt in the south. And so I think identifying a paradigm that can help us kind of bracket when this is valid, because right now we're in an unprecedented low lake level condition. We want to make sure we keep an eye on, well, when the lake comes back up, does this still apply? But what I think our goal, what we've been talking about, is minimizing our salinity exceeding a certain value in the south arm by manipulating the berm. And I think that's really the goal of this, is to try to minimize those excursions above a certain number, by manipulating the berm. And then I tried to just summarize some of the things I've been hearing, that we've been talking about, and certainly some of my observations. But I think we would all agree that salinity is highest usually in the fall, and typically coincides when the lake is at its low point in the fall. From my spreadsheet exercise, it looked like that we exceeded the range. We exceeded 160 grams per liter only when water levels were lower than 41.92 in the last 10 years. We haven't had very many years where we've been lower than that in the record, but that's when it happened. And we exceeded 160 grams per liter if the spring value was at or above 140, because if we drop 2 to 3 feet of water level in a year, that means that we will gain on the order of 20 plus grams per liter of salinity each year. Salinity is usually lowest in the spring when the water level is highest, and then here again for that same period, 2010 to 2022, only using values at 3510, and that salinity was below 120 to 160 only when the preceding fall did not exceed 140. So this was on the low side, which isn't really our concern at this point. Our primary concern at this point. And then there's just some observations in terms of, we see more precipitation of salt during summer in the North Arm. Exporting high saline water from the South Arm to the North Arm does serve as a mechanism to export salt mass to the North Arm. And then, but I guess jumping to what I want to make sure we have time here is in terms of, this could be expressed as just a flow chart, a kind of decision-making flow chart. And number one is, I think, is the intensity of monitoring. We don't necessarily need to be monitoring a lot, and I guess that's a very relative term, but highly intensive monitoring when we have a crisis, I think. And that's what number one really gets at, is if we're above, and I had suggested a range of 120 to 160. If we're within that range, then we're okay. If we're above that, then we need to be keeping a closer eye on what's going on in the lake. So that's, I think, fairly straightforward, and just kind of going back. If we exceed 160, we do more sampling. If we stay below 160, then we can just go back to our normal paradigm.
What do you do when it gets below 120?
Right, I think that would be the same kind of a trigger, is if we got below 120,
What do you do with it?
we have to.
Last time, there was no restriction, you just pumped all the salt to the North Arm. And there was no solution to it.
Yeah, and
There was no solution to it. It got down to 1.06, something
What
like
year are
that.
you talking about, Tom?
1986, 87.
But there was also, we would be able, I think we'll have a better idea this time around about forecasting, so we know our snowpack, and we could say,
I'm just
like,
saying.
but what
There
Jeff
was nothing
is-
you could do. There was
No,
nothing.
I know, but what Jeff is saying right here is that in this protocol, you just don't
You
raise the
just
berm.
deepen the breach and you let more return flow of heavy ground. There was such a flow before, your salt, no, there wasn't. Your salt mass was so diluted, you were down to a low density, you couldn't get anything. You washed out all the salt.
So that happened whether that would happen whether the berm was there
Right.
or not. And so I think in this scenario, what Jeff is suggesting is that if we get to a point where we're concerned about not having enough salinity, we simply are not raising the berm, and we're probably in a scenario where we're lowering the berm to bring it back in. And so we'll have to, hopefully adapt it. Yeah, we'll have to remain adaptable. But I think that if we have a year like, 3 consecutive years like the 80s, we're going to be in the opposite scenario here, where we're all sitting here together, scratching our heads, thinking about all of the available tools.
There wasn't much you could do.
But the culverts were already failing at the time, Tom. Right now we have
1985, they dug a 120-foot wide breach over on the west end. It
Yeah.
was a full mooring river.
Yeah, and exported it all this out.
4193, right?
Yeah.
Is that the approximate elevation of the
Bottom.
Yeah.
So it
So
was in 2000. Back then it was more like 4198 or something.
and so I think that regardless of that, we're dealing with a scenario where that culvert still exists. So we would be spilling regardless of what we do in the breach, and allowing that flow.
You're not getting much
So,
backflow because all the flow goes one way.
So I think that's why it's important when at that very first line in the goal is that this is applicable for this condition.
I think you need to make a matrix that goes both ways. I think you have approaches on it. Yeah, we're feeling pretty happy this year. Oh, we're kind of close, but things can change radically, and they have historically.
Exactly. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to work toward with our adaptive management plan, long-term plan. I think right now we're faced with what do we do with this berm, this year in this low lake condition. And so I think, I think the crux. Oh, Bill, I'm sorry.
I just want to approach you again on the underlining that this is precisely why we need the ability to bring salt back in without reducing the water level. And the only way you can do that is by allowing flow at the base of the berm only. And the only way you're going to do that is with openings, which in my opinion is stackable blocks to be able to do that, because a more engineered system than that probably will fail. So the point being that we got to stop thinking about this berm as something we only raise and lower, because there may be scenarios, it sounds like there will be, where we need to bring salt back in without dropping the water level.
Bill, I totally agree with that. And I think when we get to that point where we have that ability, we'll have to come back and revise the protocol to reflect that. But for now, with only 11 minutes left.
No, I
I'd
totally
like to-
agree. Totally agree. Just underlining it because some of the conversation went that way.
Sure, and I think this is, again, so the Salinity Committee is going to make a recommendation to forestry to make that, to formalize that protocol. So I think that should be part of the suggestion from the committee, is that we make a suggestion that we're pursuing some sort of, more modifiable, we won't even call it a berm, but a feature that allows just for that. But since we only have 10 minutes available to discuss this today, I'd like to come back next time and be able to finalize the recommendation. So with that, I just want to make sure that hopefully everybody's had a chance to look at this and has some ideas about, what they think is necessary. But what Jeff put together here it really captures a pretty simple solution. In the spring, if we're at a desirable salinity level and we can establish what that is, then we may not have to do anything. We know exactly what that threshold is. And we decide at that point, based on that, we're not going to raise the berm. But if we did have to raise the berm, and I guess we'll probably be looking at it earlier than spring, but if we do have to raise the berm and we capture that, what we really need to do is develop a protocol for when we release that water to the north arm, because there's some advantages. We're going to send some salt to the north arm. But as Andrew said, we don't want to do it too early because we don't want to affect the way the salt's precipitating out of the north arm. So I think what we need to do is just decide what that window is. And then the following year, we need to decide, what does it look like again? Did we hit our target, or do we need to do the exact same thing again? It really is, at this point, I think that simple. And then we hone in on the details. And I think what Phil had suggested gives us some really good base information, and what Christine put together on like where those levels are. But we know right now 4192 is where the berm is at. So I think it'd be good to establish this year, what is it going to look like to take it back down? If there's a head difference, when are we going to send that water? When's the best time to do that? And then we probably need to develop that out of
Yeah, I would just suggest that these elevations we review on a yearly basis based on the salt maps.
I love that. I think that's a great idea because it's going to change. And I think we're also limited to an elevation for a structure at about 4193, unless we're going to go in and modify the, the west culvert as well. But I think that what I've seen from, from Bill and from Christine is that we might be in a pretty good shape. We might be in pretty good shape as we're, topping the 4192 and sending some of that salt over with spring runoff. The modeling that I've seen, and I know it's limited, and we need better information. It's pretty promising for this year. And so I think I think hopefully we'll all be surprised and dancing and rejoicing, not just the rain. But,
can I ask? There's, I'm not a brine shrimp expert by any means, but some of the terminology that we use is confusing and incongruent. Okay, we talk about the ideal salinity range of 12 to 16. In Thomas's paper released yesterday, there's a temporary acceptable salinity range is higher than 16. I'm reading pieces of legislation that talk about emergency triggers, at a 16. If that's the optimal range, emergency triggers doesn't seem to be congruent with that. And I guess I think it'd be good to have commonality, and general.
Tom, sorry, before you respond, I just want to mention, when we talk about the protective range, we're not just talking about brine shrimp. This is for brine flies. It's something that this committee agreed upon. The 12 to 16%, the 120 to 160 grams per liter was something this committee,
I'm not going back on that, but is 160 the emergency level, or is it a kind of a above that is a yellow optimal level?
Let's operate within what we have right now, which is the 120 to 160, and we know also that we've come out of that range before, and now we're trying to prevent ourselves from hurdling ourselves across the range. I think everybody's okay if we hit 165 at the end of evaporation season, we probably did okay, but when we're hitting 180, we didn't do so well.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying we should have consistent nomenclature, okay, on those thresholds. That's a very reasonable thing to ask.
Let me just respond to that. When that manuscript was written, it was more than a year ago, and we were going off of what we could find in the literature. In the literature, we couldn't find anything on Great Salt Lake Artesian. In the meantime, Gary Golofsky has done a lot of research, and he's actually putting a trigger of 15% in there, much lower. And when you look at, I think more recently, Bonnie was saying that there's, genetic variation that starts to happen around that 15%.
That's a new paper that just came out in January.
So anyway, I'm just saying that I agree and I understand what you're saying. I'm just saying that as the science gives us more information, for brine shrimp, I'm not talking about other species, it tends to tighten that range rather than expand it.
And I think what's important is we have the matrix that we came up with, and the intent was to identify a protective range. And I think Joe, you are right in that, we need to define, well, what does protective mean versus critical versus,
I'm not suggesting ever go ahead into critical.
Because I think the matrix, the intent with the matrix was that would be updated with new information, as we get it. But I think what we want to make sure, and I think that's what one of the key action items here is to say, okay, well, what is that critical threshold that where we have to be manipulating the berm?
And if 16 is the critical threshold, then we shouldn't call it the optimal threshold,
right?
The optimal range, because optimal.
You're right. You're right. Yeah. And just to be clear, when we came up with a 12 to 16 for brine shrimp, you go down to 10. We're totally fine. But the 12 was put in place because I think at that time, Tom was concerned about going too low. That was a compromise on that.
Yeah, you've got another. This is a man-made managed lake, and it's been that way since at least the 1950s. So we make choices, and we make balancing things. And I think Thomas points out correctly. He would have preferred a little lower, and frankly, I prefer a little higher than 1.6 for economic viability of the South Arm. We'd have twice as much capacity if we had more salinity.
And understanding we need the science to guide those garbage. But
I want to
I think, part of what you're talking about in this range, where we can set critical, there's a timing component to that. Because while the Artemia, again, speaking in what we do in the brine shrimp, the Artemia can survive above that 160, but they can't hatch above that 160. And so this springtime, this March, April, May, like we need to be below that 160. I think that's where Gary's getting at with 15, is we need to be in the 15 range to trigger the hatch to even have brine shrimp to then persist through those higher salinities. So that your critical trigger could have a timing component. I think the strawman document gets that.
Right, and that's exactly, and I think those are some of the questions that I left here.
I agree. We need to keep your, that nomenclature.
Clear.
I'll tell you, up on the hill, there is complete confusion on it. We're talking about emergency triggers at 4198.
Who's confused, Joe?
That doesn't feel like a 41.
You'd love to get with them and set things straight, because I think we have a lot of.
Brown bag.
What's that?
It needs to be a brown bag session because they're talking about emergency triggers at 4198 relative to Berm management plan. And like, when's the last time that happened? That's not an emergency trigger. And they're talking about this 12 to 16, which in many documents is stated as an optimal range. Okay, but there's a temporarily, acceptable range if you bump into a low 16, for a short period of time. But it's making those concepts congruent. I know.
Yeah, it needs to happen.
Just a quick point, optimal for shrimp and flies and the things they eat is hovering around 12%. Anything above that takes more energy from their biochemistry to live. And so they produce better, they breathe better, everything happens better at 12%. I'm speaking in percent now, so 120. So we decided as a committee, when we investigated all of these papers and everything that we could find on the biology, we decided that up to 160 was good. We decided that 170 was where we should sound the alarms, and then we're like, well, that's stupid because then we've exceeded the range. That was how the conversation went, right? So we decided that 160 was where we should sound the alarms. My second point is that when you're having a conversation with people who are not close to the science or don't read science, they need really simple messages. And I'm talking here about the legislature. So really simple messages. So I agree with Joe that we need to get our language right when we're speaking outwardly, because I think we understand what we're talking about on this committee, but maybe words like triggering and alarm bells and whatever need to be associated with what that means. So I think that's good when you transition, even in this room, between the people who are engineers and chemists versus people who are biologists. There's always a different way to think about it.
And what Congress offered 5 minutes ago was that's meaningful to me. Now I understand that there's a hatching piece.
Yeah.
I didn't consider that.
It's a big deal.
But
Biology
I think
messy.
you can put thresholds kind of above and below 12 to 16 range.
Yeah.
So quick.
I'm looking here at USGS report 2332. It shows between 1850 and 1963, there was probably 10 years when it was below 60.
Yes, and they would have been very happy, right?
Just saying, that's how it was. The brine shrimp were what they were, but it was always above 16, except for 10 years and nearly 100.
Yeah, nobody's saying that everybody lives in their optimal, right?
Sure.
Right, nobody's saying that, but when you take these animals and you put them in the lab and you ask them what's their happy place, where do they not exhibit stress? It's 12%, right?
Wow.
So that's all.
Natural populations are always.
Nobody's saying it shouldn't be 160. Nobody's saying that. What we're saying is, where do we assign the alarm bells? And above that gets really critical for their biology. So
I'm
then
just saying historically.
it doesn't really matter where they've been. What matters is what is optimal for the animal and their production.
I think we're at the end of the scheduled time. I think that at this point, Jeff, I think we should schedule our next meeting, and then also ensure that everybody knows, we really need to dive into this straw man and see if that's something that we can, manipulate to all walk away being happy with. I think this discussion about the protective range, that's the range we want to be in. So we need to know, I think the goal is how do we keep it within that range, knowing that there might be times when we're out of the range. But so we should schedule the next meeting as soon as everybody's comfortable. I think we had suggested March 6th for the next meeting, if I remember correctly, Jeff. So if that seems to work for everyone, that's the session will be over. It'll allow for folks to start diving back into this. But the afternoon of the 6th, if that works, we can hopefully come back here and finalize a protocol with the sole purpose of the next meeting really to be to dissect that. And
But I think before we can do that, we have some action items.
Yeah.
And so that's what I guess I want to make sure we talk about here. And I think even if it takes an extra 5 minutes. Okay. So I think, I guess some of the action items I think we have are, if you look at this protocol, we have this, when I look back at our memo for the salinity matrix, and we call the range of 120 to 160 as the protective range. And I agree, there were reasons why I think we started out with a much broader range and we changed it back for different reasons on both ends. And but what I think we need to do here is we need to identify what is some of these timing things that Kyle, you were talking about is during the spring, what do we need to see for us to, so there's a biology effect, but then there's also a abiotic effect of, if we only achieve 160 in the spring, what could that potentially mean in the fall? Or if we only get to 120, or if we get to 120 in the spring, where do we end up in the fall?
That may be an ask for each of the committee members is, how does that trigger affect your area of expertise? Because, like I say for the branch room, we would like to see under 160, or we need under 160 in the spring, but how does that affect you guys feeling in the fall? How does that affect, you know what I mean? Like looking at, does that trigger something different for you guys?
I mean, the conversations I've had with Thomas and around, it feels like that spring concentration needs to be something with a 140.
Yeah.
Something in the 140s, and that's you need to solve for 6 months later. We understand that, but it's just, the berm is also, a significant action too, and that shouldn't be lost.
Right, for sure. And I think I think that spring number is important. Thanks. And then the fall number, which is where we get our highest numbers, is important. And so identifying what numbers those should be. And I think one of the, science action items would be, I don't know, Christine, if you could rerun your mass balance analysis that you did, that you just showed us, with the berm, assuming 41, it's in place now. What volumes do we have? Are we talking about here with our spring runoff? Because we'd like to track. We want to monitor what happens this spring with berm in place. We want to understand with the volume of inflow that we have, how does that match up with what we're talking about? I think that's a little bit of a forecast. I think Phil, if you could look at the curves that you put together, and I don't know if we have data for 2022, and if we can do something for what we know so far for 2023 to try to bracket those elevations from an overall salt mass versus elevation standpoint. I think those, and then the last key item in this protocol that I put together, I think I want everybody to think about, because it's important, is just as I was thinking about it, is if the berm was successful, and we've been able to lower the salinity as far as we want to get it, wherever that flow number is, does the berm need to stay there? Can we lower it? But then as I was thinking about, well, if we don't hit our salinity target in the spring, does leading the berm at 4192 help us the most? or does drop, and I think this is kind of along the lines of Christine that you had proposed, is what if we could drop the berm at a certain point in time where we can flush salt mass, and put move that salt mass into the north arm so that we reduce that salt mass in the south arm, but we also create volume for the next spring inflow to come in and dilute it. And so I think the hypothesis is, well, if we did have a twice a year berm or structure
Raising festival.
or dropping festival, because I don't know. I mean, when I looked at this data, I don't know that we can't turn this on the dime. This is going to take, ongoing management, and we're going to have to keep evaluating conditions as they change to keep making decisions that make sense. And so I think that's one of the important premises of the straw man, is that basically my preliminary conclusion is that we'll probably drop it, that might mean dropping the berm anyway, regardless of whether we hit the number or we don't. If we don't hit the number, then it becomes much more important to have it dialed in, because we want to know what kind of volume of water do we want to flush to the north arm, and then bring it back up to 4192 to capture more spring inflow. So I think I think on the biology side, if you can look at, I think we should continue to revisit our matrix and say, as I recall, at 170, it wasn't, I think microbialites, that was more than just an alarm bell. That was we got a big problem.
Yeah, their
At
optimum's
170.
like 10, so like they're already at 15 or like not as great as they could be, so by the time we get to 17.
So I think revisiting the matrix and identifying, especially the seasonal component.
We also don't have any birds red zoned for the matrix, which is something that I think we should revisit or have outsourced some of that bird information now that we have some awesome charts that National Audubon and DWR have produced for us based on what bird species are eating the flies and eating the shrimp. And so we could maybe map that.
That would be great. Who would be best to do that?
John Neal and Max Monquist really probably worked the hardest on that, Kyle.
Yeah, they would be the ones.
But I have the National Audubon tables that they created, which are super helpful because we didn't really understand who was eating the flies at what point in their life cycle. And so they've got it. It's all referenced. It's amazing. So I can send that to you, but I don't know if we want to outsource that to them and ask them to build that line, because instead of just saying birds, it probably should say, fly eaters, shrimp eaters, I don't know.
Yeah.
That relate to the salinity. It would
Yeah.
not be the wetlands, right? It would just be in the open ones.
And then over the next 5 years, we just had a new student start with Mike Conover at Utah State, and we're with the goal of building a bioenergetics. And so that's
Great.
that can definitely feed into the matrix as we discover more stuff.
That's awesome.
So let's revisit the matrix on the biology side. So if you can, I guess,
Matrix reloaded.
follow up on that, and
What's
then
that?
Matrix reloaded.
Right, just look at that.
and then but add the timing component. We want to identify a spring number and a fall number to help with the protocol. I think that's what we need to try to identify, and then we just work toward refining that. There we go. And then I think the mass balance question is going to be important for, does flushing make sense? Or not?
Flushing always makes sense.
It's the timing of the flushing that we
Not
want
the
to make sure.
camera.
It makes sense. So anything, I guess, any other action items? I think the other thing is to think about where we want to be sampling salinity and depth, nail that down, because if we say 160, where and when and where, where are we doing that? So I think Christine, the work you presented last October was great, and along those lines of, you looked at all the different sample sites and timing, As I recall, it was pretty homogeneous, but then you have the Bear River effect, and I think we want to identify where to do that. And so I think if we can address those, the timing, those thresholds, and we can identify the mass balance questions, I think we can validate whether this makes sense or not.
So what's your plan for the west end, berm, or west end reach? You get to 4193, let's flow through there. 4193.8. 4194. I'll get out my shovel and look at that.
So, but I guess, Tom, that's something we'll have to evaluate at that point. Right now, I think we want to identify what these thresholds are that we're trying to manage to, and this speaks to if-then statements. You know, if we see this, then this is what we want to do, and it all keeps coming back. You know, to test. You know, are we seeing what we expect to see? And if we don't, I think we need to be asking, is this really what we want to be doing? So it's a continuous evaluation process.
You know, I think we need to refine our mission to water resources, pointing out our state, our equation of state is biased a little bit. So if you have 160, it's really 15 point or 14.7 on salinity. So maybe we gotta look, understand that.
Yeah. So bias how? I mean, relative to what information?
If we're saying it's 15%.
Let's take this offline, but I think anything else?
Yeah, I got one other typo we got to fix.
Okay.
PPT in small letters means parts per trillion. If you want parts per thousand, it's supposed to be big P, big P, big T. That's been bugging me for years.
I know everyone wants to go. I think what Tom's talking about is when you convert from grams per liter to percent, it's not just move the decimal place. There's a little bit more math involved. We can talk about that.
That's not in class.
Another one. Thank you, everybody.
So are you set on March 6th? Is that what you're saying?
Oh, any March 6th? I'm out of
Spring
town.
break, I'm out of here.
You're out of town that day?
I'm out of town. I'm in Moab.
I'll send a doodle poll out today.
March 3.
That's what we got earlier is preferable for us.
Oh, wow.
We're gonna be jumping into the water and all this other stuff the next week after that.
You're going.
Take care, bud.